During the wedding party, the billionaire's son falls and everyone hesitates to help. Only the humble maid acts, and the outcome changes everything forever. Before we get into the topic, if you feel inclined, you can leave a comment in our space below. Please remember to like this video and follow our channel so you don't miss our next upload. The crystal chandeliers cast rainbow prisms across the manicured lawns of the Wellington estate as Hollywood's elite celebrated the wedding of business mogul Robert Wellington to pharmaceutical heiress Victoria Ashford. 7-year-old Alexander Wellington navigated through the crowd of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos in his state-of-the-art titanium wheelchair, its quiet electric motor barely audible above the string quartet's melodic performance. Despite the grandeur surrounding him, Alexander felt invisible among the adults who spoke over his head about stock portfolios and charity galas. His small hands gripped the wheelchair's armrests as he maneuvered around flowing evening gowns and polished shoes that cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Alexander, darling, stay close to Nanny Morrison," his father Robert called from across the terrace, where he stood surrounded by fellow billionaires discussing their latest acquisitions. The man's attention immediately returned to his conversation about oil futures and tech investments, leaving his son feeling like an afterthought in his own family's celebration. Alexander had been paralyzed from the waist down since a tragic accident 3 years ago, when his biological mother crashed their car during a fierce custody dispute. The memories of that night remained hazy, flashing lights, screaming sirens, and waking up in a hospital bed with legs that would never move again. His father rarely spoke about his first wife, and Alexander had learned not to ask questions that made the powerful man's jaw clench with barely controlled emotion. The evening air carried the scent of gardenias and expensive perfume as Alexander wheeled himself toward the dessert table, hoping to find something sweet to ease the loneliness that seemed to follow him wherever he went. His custom wheelchair, worth more than many cars, drew admiring comments from adults who praised its advanced technology while carefully avoiding direct eye contact with the small boy operating it. "Impressive engineering," commented Senator Bradley, gesturing toward Alexander's chair with his champagne flute. "Top of the line, I imagine." "Robert always buys the best." Alexander forced a polite smile, accustomed to being discussed as if he were an expensive accessory rather than a child with feelings and thoughts of his own. The wheelchair represented his independence, but it also marked him as different in a world where perfection was the only acceptable standard. As the evening progressed, Alexander found himself relegated to the periphery of the celebration, watching from his chair as couples danced on the marble terrace. His new stepmother, Victoria, had barely spoken to him beyond a perfunctory greeting, her attention focused entirely on networking with potential clients for her family's pharmaceutical empire. Near the kitchen entrance, Alexander noticed a woman in a simple grey uniform methodically cleaning champagne glasses and arranging fresh flower centerpieces. She moved with quiet efficiency, invisible to the wealthy guests who wouldn't acknowledge her presence if their lives depended on it. Unlike everyone else at the party, she smiled warmly when their eyes met, her weathered hands pausing in their work to wave discreetly. "Maria Santos," she whispered when Alexander wheeled closer, her voice carrying a slight accent that reminded him of the Spanish lullabies his old nanny used to sing. "I work in housekeeping. You must be Alexander." For the first time all evening, someone had spoken directly to him, rather than about him. Maria's kind eyes held no pity, no uncomfortable sympathy, just genuine warmth that made something tight in Alexander's chest begin to relax. "How did you know my name?" Alexander asked, intrigued by this woman who seemed to see him as a person rather than a tragic figure to be pitied or ignored. "Your papa. He shows pictures sometimes when I clean his office. Always smiling in those photos you are. Very handsome boy." Maria's English carried the careful precision of someone who had worked hard to master a second language. Their conversation was interrupted by the band announcing the first dance. Alexander watched his father sweep Victoria across the terrace in a perfectly choreographed waltz that had probably been rehearsed with professional instructors. The crowd applauded politely, cameras flashed, and society reporters scribbled notes about the merger of two powerful families. Feeling suddenly overwhelmed by the spectacle, Alexander decided to retreat to a quieter corner of the estate. He guided his wheelchair along a stone pathway that led to a secluded garden area, away from the noise and artificial cheerfulness of the reception. The path, designed more for aesthetics than accessibility, proved challenging to navigate in the growing darkness. As Alexander attempted to maneuver around a particularly tight corner near an ornamental fountain, his wheelchair's front wheel caught the edge of a decorative stone. The chair lurched violently to the side, throwing Alexander's slight 7-year-old frame forward with devastating force. The titanium frame twisted with a sickening crack as it struck the fountain's marble base. Alexander found himself sprawled on the cold stone pathway, his legs twisted beneath the wreckage of his $60,000 mobility device. Pain shot through his shoulder and ribs where he'd hit the ground, but the emotional agony of his helplessness cut far deeper than any physical injury. For several minutes, Alexander lay there calling for help, his young voice barely carrying over the distant sounds of celebration. Tears of frustration and humiliation streamed down his face as he realized that none of the hundreds of wealthy, powerful people at his father's wedding could hear his cries, or perhaps they simply chose not to respond. The twisted wheelchair frame pinned his legs at an uncomfortable angle, and Alexander's attempts to free himself only resulted in sharp edges of broken plastic and metal cutting into his skin. Blood from small cuts on his hands mixed with tears as panic began to set in. He was trapped, injured, and completely alone, despite being surrounded by more millionaires and billionaires than existed in most small countries. Then he heard footsteps running toward him across the stone pathway, and Maria Santos appeared in her grey uniform, her face etched with concern and determination that transformed her gentle features into something fierce and protective. Dios mío! Maria gasped, dropping to her knees beside Alexander without regard for her uniform or the stone pathway that would surely leave stains. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking him for serious injuries while speaking in a mixture of English and Spanish that somehow comforted him more than any of his father's expensive doctors ever had. "I'm okay, I think," Alexander whispered, though his voice shook with pain and embarrassment. "Just stuck, the wheelchair is broken." Maria's eyes filled with tears as she surveyed the wreckage of the sophisticated mobility device. The titanium frame had buckled completely, its computer systems dark and unresponsive. Electronic components sparked occasionally in the growing darkness, sending tiny flashes of light across the destruction. "We get you out of here, mijo," Maria said firmly, using an endearment that Alexander didn't understand, but that filled him with unexpected warmth. "Can you move your arms? Your shoulders?" Alexander tested his limbs carefully. His shoulder ached from the impact, and several cuts on his hands stung sharply, but nothing seemed seriously damaged. "I think so, but my legs are trapped under the chair." Without hesitation, Maria began lifting pieces of the broken wheelchair frame, her face set with determination as she worked to free Alexander's paralyzed legs from the twisted metal and plastic. Her grey uniform grew dirty and torn as she maneuvered the heavy components, but she never paused in her efforts to help him. "The party," Alexander began, glancing toward the distant terrace where music and laughter continued unabated. "Someone should tell my father." "Right now only you matter," Maria interrupted gently, finally freeing his legs from the wreckage. "Your papa, he will understand. Come, let me help you." To Alexander's amazement, Maria lifted him into her arms as if he weighed nothing at all. Despite being a small woman, she carried him with the strength and confidence of someone accustomed to hard physical labor. Her embrace felt different from the careful, clinical handling he received from nurses and therapists. Warmer, more natural, filled with genuine affection rather than professional obligation. "I'm too heavy," Alexander protested weakly, though he made no effort to pull away from the comfort of her arms. "Nonsense. You are perfect size for carrying." Maria's voice carried absolute conviction, as if the idea of him being a burden had never occurred to her. "My arms, they carry many heavy things. One beautiful boy is no problem." As Maria carried him back toward the house, Alexander felt something he hadn't experienced since his accident: complete safety in another person's care. Her heartbeat against his cheek was steady and reassuring, her arms strong and secure around his small frame. For a few precious minutes, he wasn't the disabled son of a billionaire or a tragic figure deserving pity. He was simply a child being comforted by someone who genuinely cared about his well-being. "Where are we going?" Alexander asked, as Maria bypassed the main terrace where the wedding reception continued in full swing. "Kitchen. Clean your cuts. Make sure you are really okay. Then we find your papa." Maria's practical approach impressed Alexander, who was accustomed to adults either panicking over his condition or dismissing his needs entirely. The kitchen bustled with catering staff, preparing additional courses for the reception. Several workers looked up in surprise as Maria entered carrying Alexander, but none questioned her presence or authority. They simply moved aside, offering clean towels and first aid supplies with the efficiency of people accustomed to handling unexpected situations. Maria settled Alexander on a clean prep counter and began gently cleaning the cuts on his hands with warm water and antiseptic. Her touch was incredibly gentle, and she hummed softly while working, a Spanish melody that seemed to ease the sting of the wounds and the deeper pain of his isolation. "You have children?" Alexander asked, fascinated by her natural maternal instincts. Maria's hands stilled for just a moment, something painful flickering across her features before she resumed her careful ministrations. "I had a son once. Long time ago now." "What happened to him?" "He was taken from me when he was very small, before you were born." Maria's voice carried a sadness so profound that Alexander felt it in his own chest. Sometimes life is not fair, even to little boys who deserve better. Alexander studied her face, noting the way her eyes grew distant and haunted when she spoke about her lost child. Something about her expression reminded him of his own father during those rare moments when Robert thought no one was watching, grief carefully hidden beneath layers of success and control. "I'm sorry," Alexander said softly, surprising himself with the genuine sympathy in his voice. At 7 years old, he was already learning that pain came in many forms and that some wounds never fully healed. "You are a very kind boy," Maria smiled, finishing her work on his hands and checking the bruise developing on his shoulder. "Your mama, she teach you good manners." "I don't remember my mother very well," Alexander admitted. "She died in the car accident that hurt my legs. Papa doesn't like to talk about her." Maria's entire body went rigid, her dark eyes searching Alexander's face with sudden intensity that made him slightly uncomfortable. Her hands, which had been steady and sure while treating his injuries, began to tremble almost imperceptibly. "Your mother, she died in car accident?" Maria's voice was barely above a whisper. 3 years ago, I was in the car too, but I don't remember much. Just that Papa was very sad afterward, and my legs stopped working." Alexander accepted the tragedy with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children often display toward circumstances beyond their control. Tears began flowing down Maria's cheeks, though she tried to wipe them away before Alexander could notice. Her breathing became shallow and rapid, as if she were fighting some internal battle between hope and despair. "What was your mama's name?" The question emerged as barely a whisper. "Isabella. Isabella Santos Wellington." Alexander recited the name he'd heard spoken only a handful of times, usually in hushed conversations between his father and lawyers. "Papa said she was beautiful and that she loved me very much." The color drained completely from Maria's face, and she gripped the edge of the prep counter so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Around them, the kitchen staff continued their work, oblivious to the earth-shattering revelation unfolding in their midst. "Santos," Maria repeated, her voice breaking on the familiar surname. "Isabella Santos. Did you know her?" Alexander asked innocently, unaware that his simple question had just shattered Maria's carefully constructed world. "Your last name is Santos, too." Maria stared at him with eyes that held recognition, anguish, and a desperate hope that threatened to consume her entirely. After 7 years of believing her child was lost forever, she was looking into the face of the son who had been stolen from her arms when he was just 6 months old. But before she could find her voice to respond, the kitchen doors burst open and Robert Wellington strode in, flanked by security personnel and looking absolutely furious. "What the hell is going on here?" Robert's voice cut through the kitchen like a blade, his powerful presence immediately commanding the attention of every person in the room. His tuxedo was still immaculate despite his obvious agitation, and his piercing blue eyes swept the scene before settling on Alexander in Maria's protective embrace. "Papa!" Alexander called out, relief evident in his voice despite the tension radiating from his father. "My wheelchair broke and Maria helped me. She carried me here and cleaned my cuts." Robert's gaze shifted to Maria, who had gone completely pale and seemed unable to speak or move. Her hands trembled visibly as she stepped back from Alexander, her eyes never leaving the man she had once loved and who had destroyed her life with surgical precision. "Maria Santos," Robert said slowly, recognition dawning in his voice like a gathering storm. "It's been a long time." The kitchen staff sensed the electricity in the air and began quietly retreating to other areas, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple accident. Only Alexander remained oblivious to the undercurrents of history and pain swirling around him. "You two know each other?" Alexander asked, looking between his father and the woman who had shown him more genuine kindness in 30 minutes than he'd received from most people in years. "We knew each other once," Robert replied carefully, his business mask firmly in place despite the emotional earthquake occurring beneath the surface. "Ms. Santos used to work for our family in a different capacity." Maria found her voice at last, though it emerged as barely a whisper. "Before you had me deported on false charges, before you told everyone I was dead." Alexander's young mind struggled to process the hostility in Maria's tone and the way his father's jaw had clenched with barely controlled anger. These two adults shared a history that ran much deeper than employer and employee, and the weight of their unspoken conflict filled the kitchen with an almost suffocating tension. "Deported?" Alexander asked, confused. "But you work here now. You helped me." "I came back," Maria said, her eyes never leaving Robert's face. "I work many jobs, save every penny for 3 years to pay smugglers to bring me home. I find work here because this is the only place I can be close to." She stopped abruptly, realizing how much she was revealing. Robert stepped forward, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. "Close to what, Maria? What exactly are you doing in my house?" "Close to my son," Maria whispered, the words hanging in the air like an explosive device waiting to detonate. Alexander looked between them, his 7-year-old mind working to understand connections that the adults were discussing in half-sentences and loaded silences. Something about Maria's tears when she'd asked about his mother, The way she'd held him so naturally, the familiar surname they shared. "Your son?" Alexander asked slowly. "But I thought you said he was taken away when he was little." Maria's tears flowed freely now as she knelt down to Alexander's eye level, her hands reaching toward him before stopping just inches away, as if she were afraid he might disappear if she touched him. "He was, Mijo. When he was just 6 months old, men came to our little apartment. They said I was illegal, that I was unfit, Mother. They took my beautiful baby boy and told me he would be adopted by good family. They told me he would have better life." Robert's face had gone completely rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "That's enough, Maria. Alexander doesn't need to hear these lies. They are not lies." Maria's voice cracked with 7 years of suppressed anguish. "You paid those men, Roberto. You paid immigration officers, social workers, judges. You stole my baby because you wanted him for yourself, and you made sure I could never come back to claim him." Alexander's world tilted on its axis as understanding crashed over him like a tidal wave. The car accident that had killed his mother and paralyzed him, the father who never spoke about his past, the woman whose embrace had felt like coming home. "You're my real mother." Alexander's voice was barely audible, but it carried the weight of a lifetime of questions, finally finding their answers. "Sí, mi amor," Maria sobbed, no longer able to maintain any distance between herself and the child she had mourned for 7 years. "You are my baby, my beautiful boy that I never stopped looking for." Dawn. The kitchen fell completely silent, except for Maria's quiet crying and the distant sounds of the wedding reception, where hundreds of wealthy guests continued celebrating in blissful ignorance of the family drama unfolding just yards away. Robert's carefully constructed world of power and control was crumbling before his eyes, and Alexander could see the panic beneath his father's composed exterior. The man who could command boardrooms and bend politicians to his will was faced with a truth that money and influence couldn't manipulate or destroy. "Alexander," Robert said carefully, his voice taking on the persuasive tone he used during crucial business negotiations, "this woman is clearly disturbed. The trauma of losing a child has obviously affected her mental stability. Your mother died in that car accident, and while it's tragic that Ms. Santos lost her son—" "Look at him, Roberto," Maria interrupted, her voice gaining strength as maternal instinct overrode fear. "Look at his face, his eyes, the way he holds his head when he thinks. You know he is mine. You have always known." Alexander stared at his father, the man who had raised him, provided everything money could buy, but who had built their entire relationship on a foundation of lies and stolen love. Then he looked at Maria, whose tears and desperate hope told a story that resonated in his bones with the truth of shared blood and unconditional maternal love. "The accident," Alexander said slowly, pieces of a puzzle he'd never known existed finally clicking into place. "What really happened to Isabella Santos Wellington?" Robert's composure cracked completely, and for the first time in Alexander's memory, his powerful father looked genuinely afraid. "Alexander, we should discuss this privately." "There was no Isabella Santos Wellington," Maria said softly, her voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. "There was only Isabella Santos, and Roberto made sure she disappeared forever so that no one could ever find you or take you away from him." The revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow, stealing his breath and leaving him feeling more paralyzed than his useless legs had ever made him feel. Everything he thought he knew about his life, his family, his identity, was crumbling around him like the broken wheelchair that lay twisted and destroyed in the garden. As security personnel shifted uncomfortably in the doorway and the sounds of celebration continued in the distance, Alexander realized that his father's wedding night was about to become something entirely different, the beginning of a battle that would determine not just where he would live, but who he truly was and where he really belonged. The broken wheelchair in the garden was nothing compared to the shattered illusions that now lay scattered across the kitchen floor of the Wellington estate. The tension in the kitchen was shattered by the sound of approaching footsteps as Victoria Wellington appeared in the doorway, her designer wedding gown trailing behind her like liquid silver. Her perfectly sculpted face registered shock, then calculation, as she assessed the scene before her. "Robert, darling, the guests are asking where you've disappeared to. The cake-cutting ceremony." Victoria's words died as she noticed Maria's tear-stained face and Alexander's obvious distress. "What's happening here?" "A family reunion," Maria said bitterly, rising to her full height, despite being several inches shorter than the pharmaceutical heiress. "Though I suppose that makes you uncomfortable since your new husband built his fortune on stolen children." Victoria's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Security, remove this woman from the premises immediately. She's clearly mentally unstable and poses a threat to Alexander's well-being." "No!" Alexander's voice cut through the adult conversation with surprising authority. Despite being only 7 years old and sitting vulnerable on a kitchen counter, his tone carried a determination that made everyone pause. "She stays. I want to hear everything." Robert stepped closer to his son, his business mask slipping to reveal genuine desperation beneath. "Alexander, you're upset and confused. This woman has filled your head with lies designed to hurt our family. We can discuss this rationally tomorrow." "Stop calling them lies!" Alexander's voice cracked with emotion that had been building for years. "You've been lying to me my entire life. About my mother, about the accident, about everything." The wedding guests' laughter echoed from the terrace, a surreal soundtrack to the family implosion occurring in the kitchen. Maria watched her son, her beautiful, brave son, stand up to one of the most powerful men in America and felt her heart swell with pride even as it broke for the pain he was experiencing. "Alexander," Robert tried again, his voice taking on the manipulative tone he used to close billion-dollar deals. "Think about your life here. Your education, your medical care, your future, everything I've provided for you." "You mean everything you stole?" Maria interrupted, her maternal instincts overriding her fear of Robert's power. "Including my baby." Victoria stepped forward, her perfectly manicured hands clenched into fists. "This is ridiculous. Robert, call the police. Have this woman arrested for harassment and making false claims against a minor." "What false claims?" Detective Sarah Chen appeared in the kitchen doorway, her badge clearly visible on her belt. Behind her stood FBI agent Michael Torres, his presence immediately shifting the atmosphere from family drama to criminal investigation. Robert's face went ashen. "What's the meaning of this? This is a private family matter." "Mr. Wellington," Agent Torres said formally, "we have a warrant to question you regarding allegations of human trafficking, bribery of federal officials, and falsification of legal documents related to illegal adoption proceedings." The kitchen fell silent except for the distant sounds of celebration and Victoria's sharp intake of breath. Alexander stared at the law enforcement officers, trying to process the magnitude of the charges being leveled against the man he'd called father for 7 years. "Human trafficking?" Alexander whispered, the words foreign and terrifying in his young mouth. Detective Chen knelt down to Alexander's eye level, her voice gentle but professional. "Alexander, we've been investigating your father's business practices for months." A whistleblower came forward with evidence of a network that separated children from their families through fraudulent documentation and bribery. Maria's legs gave out, and she sank into a nearby chair as the reality of the situation crashed over her. "There were others? Other children stolen like my baby?" 17 documented cases over the past 12 years, Agent Torres confirmed grimly. Babies taken from undocumented immigrants, homeless mothers, women in desperate situations, all sold to wealthy families who wanted children but couldn't or wouldn't go through legitimate adoption channels. Victoria backed toward the kitchen exit, her wedding dress rustling with her nervous movements. "I had nothing to do with this. I married Robert 3 hours ago. I know nothing about his previous business dealings." "Actually, Ms. Ashford Wellington," Detective Chen said, consulting her notes, "your pharmaceutical company provided falsified medical records for several of these cases, records stating that birth mothers were drug addicts or mentally incompetent." The revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow. Not only had his father stolen him from his real mother, but his new stepmother had been complicit in similar crimes against other families. The adults he'd trusted most had built their empire on the systematic destruction of families like his own. "I want to go with her," Alexander said suddenly, pointing at Maria. "I want to go with my real mother." Robert's composure cracked completely. "Alexander, you don't understand what you're saying. Maria can't provide for you. Your medical needs alone cost hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. Your physical therapy, your specialized equipment, you mean the wheelchair that just broke?" Alexander's voice carried a bitter understanding far beyond his 7 years. "The one that left me trapped and bleeding while your rich friends ignored me? Money didn't help me tonight, Papa. Only she did." Maria moved to Alexander's side, her hands trembling as she reached for him. "Mi amor, if you come with me, life will be very different. I work 3 jobs to afford small apartment. No big house, no fancy things." "I don't care about fancy things," Alexander said firmly, leaning into his mother's embrace. "I care about someone who loves me for real, someone who doesn't lie to me." Agent Torres stepped forward with official-looking documents. "Mr. Wellington, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit human trafficking, bribery of federal officials, and 17 counts of illegal procurement of minors. You have the right to remain silent." "Wait," Alexander called out, surprising everyone by addressing his adopted father directly. "Papa, why? Why did you do this to us?" Robert's shoulders sagged as 7 years of carefully constructed lies finally collapsed under the weight of truth. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I wanted a son so badly, and I had the power to take what I wanted. Because I thought money could buy happiness, and by the time I realized it couldn't, I was too deep in the lies to find my way back to the truth." Tears streamed down Alexander's face as he processed his father's confession. The man who had raised him, provided for him, and shown him genuine affection had also pushed him from a window to silence his questions about his real mother. Love and violence had become so entangled that separating them felt impossible. "The other children," Alexander asked Agent Torres, "what happened to them?" "Some have been reunited with their biological families. Others are in protective custody while we locate their birth parents. Your case is unique because your mother never stopped looking for you, and she had the courage to come forward when she discovered your location." As Robert was led away in handcuffs, his business empire crumbling around him, Alexander made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He reached for Maria's hand, intertwining their fingers with the certainty of a child who finally understands where he truly belongs. "Mama," he said softly, the word feeling both foreign and perfectly natural on his lips. "Will you take me home?" Maria's tears fell like rain as she lifted her son into her arms for the 2nd time that night, but this time no one would ever take him away from her again. 6 weeks later, Maria's small 2-bedroom apartment in East Los Angeles bustled with an energy that Alexander had never experienced in the mansion he'd called home for 7 years. Physical therapists came and went, social workers filed their reports, and legal proceedings moved forward with the grinding efficiency of the American justice system. Alexander's new wheelchair, a standard model provided by county services, lacked the sophisticated technology of his previous equipment. but he navigated the cramped apartment with growing confidence. More importantly, he was learning to navigate a completely different world, one where love was measured in time spent together rather than dollars in a bank account. ¿Cómo estuvo la escuela hoy? Maria asked as Alexander returned from his first day at Lincoln Elementary, a public school dramatically different from the exclusive private academy he'd attended before. It was good, Alexander replied in English, though he was rapidly picking up Spanish words from their daily conversations. Tommy Martinez showed me how to play wheelchair basketball, and Mrs. Rodriguez says I can help tutor younger kids in math since I'm ahead of grade level. Maria beamed with pride as she helped him transfer from his wheelchair to the kitchen table where homework and dinner awaited. Their evening routine had become sacred, simple meals prepared together, homework completed side by side, and stories shared about their separate lives before their reunion. Your papa, he called again today, Maria said carefully, watching Alexander's reaction to mentions of Robert. The lawyer says he wants to see you before the sentencing hearing. Alexander considered this information while working through his math problems. The relationship with Robert remained complicated. He couldn't erase 7 years of genuine affection and care, even knowing the criminal foundation upon which their family had been built. What do you think I should do? Alexander asked, trusting his mother's judgment in ways he'd never trusted anyone before. I think, Maria said slowly, that forgiveness is for you, not for him. If seeing him helps you find peace, we go. If it hurts you more, we stay home. You choose. The doorbell interrupted their conversation, and Maria rose to answer it with the cautious alertness of someone who had learned not to trust unexpected visitors. Through the peephole, she saw Detective Chen holding official-looking documents. Mrs. Santos, Detective Chen said as Maria opened the door, I have news about the investigation. Alexander wheeled over to join them, his young face serious with the premature gravity that trauma often brings to children. Over the past weeks, he'd learned to read the subtle expressions of law enforcement officers and social workers, understanding that their news could change everything without warning. Robert Wellington has agreed to a plea bargain, Detective Chen announced. 25 years in federal prison, and he's turning over evidence against the entire network. Judges, immigration officials, other wealthy families involved in the trafficking ring. Everyone. Maria sank into her chair, overwhelmed by the finality of justice being served. 25 years. He will be old man when he gets out. Alexander will be 32, Detective Chen added gently. Old enough to decide for himself if he wants any relationship with the man who raised him. Alexander processed this information with the careful consideration he'd developed since learning his life story. What about the other families? The other children who were stolen? Your father's testimony is helping us reunite more families. Maria's courage in coming forward has given us the evidence we needed to bring down the entire organization. Detective Chen smiled at them both. You've helped save other children, Alexander. That's something to be proud of. After Detective Chen left, Maria and Alexander sat together in their small living room, processing the magnitude of the day's revelations. The apartment felt both cramped and perfectly spacious, limited in physical comfort, but unlimited in emotional safety. Mama, Alexander said, using the Spanish word that had become natural over the past weeks, do you think Papa really loved me, or was I just something he wanted to own? Maria considered the question carefully, understanding its importance to her son's healing process. I think he loved you as much as a man like that can love anyone. But real love, mijo, real love doesn't steal. Real love doesn't lie. Real love protects, even when it's hard. Like how you protected me tonight at the party, even though you could have lost your job. See, exactly like that. Maria pulled Alexander closer, marveling at how perfectly he fit against her side. Love means putting someone else's happiness before your own, always. Alexander's expression grew thoughtful as he worked through complex emotions that would challenge adults twice his age. I think I want to see him. Before the sentencing, I want to ask him questions. You are sure? I'm sure, but I want you there with me. I need to know you won't disappear again. Maria's heart broke and healed simultaneously at her son's words. The trauma of their separation had affected him in ways they were still discovering, but his resilience and capacity for forgiveness amazed her daily. I will never disappear again, mi amor. Never. No one has the power to take you from me now. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Victoria Wellington, no longer the radiant bride from 6 weeks earlier. Her designer clothes had been replaced with simple attire, and her face showed the strain of public scandal and federal investigation. I came to apologize, Victoria said without preamble when Maria answered the door, and to give you this. She handed Maria a certified check for $2 million, an amount that represented more money than Maria would see in several lifetimes of honest work. I don't want your money, Maria said firmly, attempting to hand the check back. It's not mine, Victoria replied. It's Alexander's, his trust fund from his biological parents' estate. Robert never touched it, probably because he knew someday the truth would come out. I'm liquidating my assets to pay restitution to all the families we hurt, but this money belongs to Alexander. Alexander wheeled over to see what was happening, his eyes widening when he saw the woman who had been his stepmother for exactly 6 weeks. Hello, Alexander, Victoria said softly. I wanted to tell you that I'm sorry for my part in all of this. I knew what Robert was doing wasn't entirely legal, but I chose not to ask questions because it benefited me financially. Are you going to prison too? Alexander asked with the directness that only children can manage. Probably. But first, I'm working with the FBI to help find the rest of the stolen children. It's not enough to make up for what I did, but it's something. Alexander studied his former stepmother with the analytical skills that made him exceptional at mathematics and pattern recognition. You're different now, sadder, but more real. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. Losing everything taught me what actually matters. I hope someday you can forgive me. I forgive you, Alexander said simply, but I'll never forget what you did to other families. After Victoria left, Maria stared at the check in her hands, overwhelmed by the possibilities it represented. Medical care, education, a larger apartment, security for their future, everything she'd worried about providing for her son. What should we do with it? Alexander asked, understanding the significance of the money even at his young age. Maria smiled, already knowing her answer. We use some for your needs, therapy, equipment, college someday. The rest we give to families who are still looking for stolen children. Money that came from crime should help heal the damage crime caused. Alexander nodded approvingly, proud of his mother's moral clarity in a situation that could have easily corrupted someone with fewer principles. They had found each other again, justice was being served, and their future, while uncertain, would be built on truth rather than lies. The broken wheelchair in the Wellington estate garden had led to the breaking of a criminal empire, but more importantly, it had led to the healing of a family that had been torn apart by greed and power. Tomorrow would bring the sentencing hearing, and Alexander would face the man who had raised him for the final time before their lives diverged permanently. But tonight, he sat in his mother's arms in their small apartment, finally understanding what family really meant. The federal courthouse in downtown Los Angeles buzzed with media attention as the Wellington trafficking case reached its conclusion. Alexander sat beside Maria in the gallery, his new wheelchair positioned so he could see both the judge's bench and the defendant's table, where Robert Wellington waited for sentencing. Robert had aged dramatically during his 6 weeks in federal custody. His once perfectly styled hair was now grey and unkempt, his expensive suits replaced with orange prison garb. When he turned to look at Alexander, the powerful businessman who had once commanded boardrooms and political offices was gone, replaced by a broken man facing the consequences of his crimes. "The defendant will rise," Judge Patricia Morales announced, her voice carrying the weight of justice that had been delayed for over a decade. Robert stood slowly, his shoulders hunched with the burden of 17 families destroyed and dozens of lives shattered by his actions. Behind him, the gallery was filled with some of those families, parents who had searched for years, children who had grown up wondering about their origins, and others like Maria who had never stopped believing they would find their stolen loved ones. "Robert Wellington," Judge Morales began, "you have pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit human trafficking, bribery of federal officials, falsification of legal documents, and 17 counts of illegal procurement of minors. Before I pronounce sentence, I'm going to hear from some of the families your crimes affected." One by one, parents and children took the stand to describe the devastation Robert's network had caused. Maria watched her son's face as he heard story after story of families torn apart, children who had grown up believing their parents had abandoned them, and parents who had spent years wondering if their children were alive. When the victim impact statements concluded, Judge Morales addressed Robert directly. "Mr. Wellington, do you have anything to say before sentencing?" Robert stood slowly, his hands shaking as he faced the courtroom filled with people whose lives he had destroyed. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I cannot undo what I have done. I cannot give back the years these families lost. I told myself I was providing good homes for children, but I know now that was just a lie to justify my greed and my desperate need to have a son." His eyes found Alexander in the gallery, and tears began flowing down his face. "Alexander, you are the best thing that ever happened to me, even though how you came to me was unforgivable. Your real mother loves you in ways I was never capable of understanding. I'm glad you found each other again." "No." Alexander felt Maria's hand squeeze his shoulder as he listened to the man who had raised him take responsibility for his crimes. Despite everything, Alexander felt a complex mixture of sadness and closure rather than anger or hatred. "I will cooperate fully with ongoing investigations to help find the remaining missing children," Robert continued. "It's not enough, but it's all I can do now to try to make amends." Judge Morales nodded grimly. "Mr. Wellington, your cooperation with authorities has been noted. However, the scale and systematic nature of your crimes demands a sentence that reflects the severity of the harm caused. I hereby sentence you to 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole." The gavel's bang echoed through the courtroom like a final punctuation mark on a chapter of Alexander's life that was now officially closed. Robert was led away without looking back, understanding that this was goodbye, not just for now, but likely forever. Outside the courthouse, Maria and Alexander were surrounded by reporters, shouting questions and cameras flashing, but Detective Chen and social workers formed a protective barrier around them. They had agreed to one brief statement, understanding that their story could help other families recognize signs of trafficking and find the courage to come forward. "My name is Alexander Santos," he said into the microphones, using his mother's surname for the first time publicly. 7 years ago, I was stolen from my real mother through a criminal network that separated families for money. Today, justice was served, but more importantly, families are being reunited." He paused, gathering courage for what he wanted to say next. "If you're a child who doesn't remember your early years, or if you're parents who had children taken from you, don't give up. The truth always finds a way to surface, and love is stronger than any lie." Maria wiped away tears as she listened to her son's words, amazed by his maturity and his commitment to helping others, even while processing his own trauma. "What's next for your family?" a reporter called out. Alexander looked up at Maria, then back at the cameras. "We're going home. To our small apartment, where we eat dinner together every night, and where nobody lies to each other. We're going to help other families find their stolen children, and we're going to prove that happiness doesn't come from money, it comes from being with people who really love you." 6 months later, the Santos family, as they now called themselves, had settled into a rhythm of healing and hope. Alexander excelled at his public school, Maria had been promoted to head of housekeeping at a local hotel, and they had used Robert's trust fund money to establish a foundation helping families separated by trafficking. On a warm Saturday afternoon, Alexander's wheelchair basketball team was playing in the championship game of the Youth League. The gymnasium was filled with families cheering, but Alexander's eyes kept finding Maria in the stands, her pride visible from across the court. During halftime, Alexander wheeled over to where Maria sat with several other parents who had become their chosen family. Detective Chen and her husband, Mrs. Rodriguez from school, and Tommy Martinez's parents, who had welcomed them into their community with open arms. "Are you happy, mijo?" Maria asked, brushing his sweaty hair back from his forehead. Alexander considered the question seriously, looking around at the modest gymnasium filled with people who had become their family, not through crime or money, but through genuine love and shared experiences. "I'm happy," he said with absolute certainty. "I have my real mother, real friends, and I'm helping other kids find their families. I don't miss the mansion or the fancy wheelchair or any of that." "Not even a little bit?" "Well," Alexander grinned, "maybe I miss the ice cream machine. But Tommy's mom makes better cookies anyway." Maria laughed, marveling at her son's resilience and his ability to find joy despite everything he'd experienced. The boy who had fallen from a broken wheelchair at a billionaire's wedding had risen into a young man who understood that true wealth was measured in love, truth, and the courage to stand up for what's right. As Alexander returned to his game, Maria reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A broken wheelchair had been the catalyst for breaking open a criminal empire, but more importantly, it had broken the cycle of lies that had kept a mother and son apart. Sometimes the most precious things in life come disguised as disasters, and sometimes the greatest victories arise from the deepest falls. In the modest gymnasium in East Los Angeles, surrounded by the laughter of children and the cheers of families, Maria Santos finally had everything she had ever wanted. Her son, their freedom, and the unbreakable bond of a love that no amount of money or power could ever destroy. The wheelchair was broken, but the family was finally whole.